I believe we are currently live on the Facebook, and YouTube is just taking a little bit longer. So, Catherine, if you want to go ahead, I think we're ready to go.
All right, we are here on the Unifying Force for the continuation of the conversation we were having last time about sequels being better than the originals. Except this time, it's the curse of the threequel and why they generally don't do as well. David, you'd like to start?
Well, okay, so we've got to say before people start coming at us with pitchforks, this isn't always the rule. I mean, the outstanding example of this didn't happen is the Holy Trilogy. In the OT, now I think it is widely accepted that they made it happen. They made a correct trilogy. They didn't go off the rails with the third. Now, I don't know that that was the case always for all people. I think some older Star Wars fans at the time saw some Ewoks and they thought that that's how it was going to go down. So this is the kind of thing that it happens is in the vast majority of franchises. We talked a little bit off camera and stuff about the one we didn't include in for sequels is the Superman trilogy, Superman 2 surpassing Superman 1. I know Catherine doesn't know what's going on, but that's okay. Kneel before Zod, just saying.
The hot take.
Yeah, and then number 3, you throw Richard Pryor into the mix, and because it's the 80s, why not throw Richard Pryor into a movie, the franchise, and it goes off the rails. So, I mean, that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's talk about how and why and what movies we think a third sequel, threequel, whatever, it was just an absolute royal mistake.
Yeah, we can look at it like, exactly 2 ways. I guess going with what's happened in the 3 trilogies we have from Star Wars, and where things went well and not so well. We already mentioned, obviously, OT did stick the landing pretty much. I think it would be the general consensus, especially relatively speaking, to maybe what comes a little later chronologically and in our time period as well. But then there's also the idea that did the third film in a particular franchise almost end the series, or at least for the time being?
Or should it have ended the series?
Yeah, yeah. There are all these little permutations of the same kind of question. It's like, there's a part A and a part B. And I think some franchises do finish pretty strongly. And usually those are the ones that have some kind of consistency behind the scenes with who's writing, who's directing, who's editing, similar production teams to have a similar tone and feel through. Previously, we discussed how the all-time great sequels, and it was all in our top echelon, was The Dark Knight within the Dark Knight trilogy by Chris Nolan. And the reason why, okay, so The Dark Knight Rises is not as popular as the first 2 films, and critically not too loved in comparison, but it's still a fairly good action adventure film. Mm-hmm. It might mess a little with some big character moments in the DC universe and within the Batman mythology, but as a standalone film, it's pretty solid. And we could definitely attribute that to Chris Nolan's guiding hand throughout, and sticking with a lot of the crew going forward from Batman Begins, and that's why it works really well. And the third film in that trilogy circles back really well to the first, and maybe there's something to kind of explore as well, is that if it is a trilogy that's been planned ahead of time, is the final film in the trilogy strengthened when they go back into what makes the film series kick off in the first place? So, for example, the whole League of Shadows storyline and Bruce Wayne, Batman's struggling identity, comes really to the fore again in the third film in that trilogy, and leans into a lot of the themes that the first villain Ra's al Ghul brought to the table. And you can say that, in the original trilogy, Return of the Jedi definitely has that focus. You bring things kind of full circle in a way. Though me saying that now, I'm thinking, well, obviously George Lucas expanded upon who Darth Vader was a lot by the time Empire kicked on.
Oh yeah.
Beyond being just a faceless supervillain. And but the story is very much finishing Luke Skywalker's hero's journey. And you could say similarly for Bruce Wayne. Well, within a set time period.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's another thing. When the characters continue, the protagonists or the heroes in the story, if they live on to the third film and kind of have the so-called happy ending, there is the possibility of somebody returning in the far-flung future, a few decades down the line, which might shake things up a bit with that character and not really fit in with maybe what some of our expectations might be, which is definitely what we see to some extent in the sequel trilogy with Luke. But there's some strong thirds in a trilogy, and there are some kind of falling off the cliff a little bit. So,
well, let's break it. We've talked to OT, and I think we'll get Catherine your feelings on the OT, the third. Stick it, hit, miss.
Return of the Jedi falters a bit because they're recycling the blow up the Death Star thing. So just like no, and there wasn't enough story for the Luke Vader Palpatine thing, because that's just about a few scenes. This is why they spent so much time on Endor and so much time on Tatooine trying to get Han back, because they just didn't have enough story for the third movie. And apparently in one of George's outlines, he was only going to use the Death Star in the third movie anyway. But once he got all that pushback from the Fox board of directors, he thought, well, if I'm only going to do one movie, I might as well just put the Death Star in the first movie. Because originally the first movie's climax was going to be like a prison break because instead of the Death Star, it was going to be like this Imperial prison that was on Cloud City before Cloud City got recycled into Empire. So it's like once they did that, it's like you gotta get back and write the third movie a little bit more. I think Lord of the Rings is probably the one trilogy which has actually stuck the landing pretty well, that without much complaint. I mean, yeah, it does the whole spectacle thing. The Battle of Gondor is not as emotionally engaging or involving as, say, the Battle of Rohan throughout the entire, because that spans the entirety of the second movie as opposed to the third. But then the basic trilogy rules of trying to make everything bigger is not necessarily better. Trying to tie everything back into the first entry and retcon things to make that happen isn't necessarily the best move either. And so, yeah, you've seen that with trilogies. Think movies fall into those types of traps. And then when you have things that nobody really intended to make, they just suddenly come out of nowhere, like Godfather 3. And it's like, it's like, oh, okay, we're doing another one of these. It's like, maybe we should have stopped to think about this before rushing into it.
Yes, planning. Kathleen Kennedy, J.J. Abrams, having a trilogy plotted out ahead of time.
Yeah. You wouldn't put up a building without plans and blueprints, first of all, would you?
Yeah, I think that's a safe assumption that Rise of Skywalker is probably the worst third entry in a trilogy.
In the Star Wars franchise,
Star Wars,
for sure, is Rise. Because, I mean, okay, we all know that Rise had its moments for me because it was fan service, and a few of those were like good fan services. It's like, yes, I wanted to see that, thank you. Some of it was like, okay, this is a bit much. Like, keep going. Do we have to put every single thing, every idea that anyone ever gave you in this movie?
At the expense of story and character
arcs, everything.
Yeah. At the expense of the characters' development. But then, The Rise of Skywalker, I think, definitely the weakest of the saga trilogies that we have. I always find it really interesting how Revenge of the Sith kind of bucks the trend of a trilogy because it's a tragedy, and so it has that operatic theme. You've had almost everyone, I guess, with the prequels of waiting to see the story of Anakin develop and to see what made him fall, and whether it was, it was a little rushed and undercooked and so on. But that's where we're fortunate if you have the time to invest in the wider franchise and have the Clone Wars that really fills in the gaps in a really positive and good way, rather than just a kind of cash grabbing, oh, let's do this because it ticks off the boxes for fans kind of way.
Right.
But I think that's what makes Revenge of the Sith, I think, one of the most interesting third acts in a film series or trilogy, because it's all dark and gloomy to finish, but with that little glistening of hope at the very end. And I think that's a really strong way to finish a trilogy that might have had the expectation of focusing on Anakin. And Revenge of the Sith did go through a lot within the plot and within character, and of course it would have been awesome to see more of that, in episodes 1 and 2. But I think Revenge of the Sith is a very strong finish for the prequel trilogy, because it groups so many things together.
I think you've hit on a really interesting point, tying back to what we were talking about last time, is how obviously for the original trilogy, for the prequel trilogy, we did not include that in the, sequel surpasses the original necessarily, because the original, The Phantom Menace, was kind of But we did talk about how changing the genre a little bit, changing what's going on, change like switching it up, is some of what makes a really good sequel. And they didn't necessarily do that for episode 2, but then episode 3 they do that, and so you've got a really good threequel where the sequel was meh.
Yeah, I guess it had the relative advantage of having a weaker second act in the trilogy, so the third had an easier job of kind of surpassing what came before, versus if you've got a really strong sequel like Empire Strikes Back or Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan or The Dark Knight, the third film has a lot to live up to, just from the opening rounds.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, we go back to, seeing even in the Nolan trilogy, is, the third act was kind of, it was good. It completely surpassed the depiction of Bane in the previous Batman movie.
Well,
Number 3
yeah.
was Forever number 3.
No,
Yeah.
Batman and Robin was number 4.
Oh, Batman and Robin was the number 4 with the Bane. It's like,
They had to reset the table a little bit.
I don't care if you
character.
didn't like the Nolan depiction of Bane, it could have been worse.
Yeah.
However, the one that in the other one kind of looked more like it was drawn in the comic, but it was, still.
Yeah.
So let's branch out, and we've talked about the Star Wars threequels is in each of the trilogies. Let's go to some of the ones you mentioned. Star Trek, that we talked about and harped on a lot because we were talking about Wrath of Khan. Search for Spock.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's I mean, admittedly, I've only seen it once, and that was as a kid, so I don't even know if that counts really. But yeah, I guess you could say in tone and feel, it's trying to do something different, or ends up doing something very different, whether it was trying to or not, from Khan as a film. Yeah. And that's where I think series sometimes take a gamble, whether they want to do something very different from what's come before. In some instances, it can work really well. As you see in Revenge of the Sith, having a tragedy, an almost kind of like a Greco-Roman tragedy and feel, and what's the fall of the main hero of the story. And then it can, or just amping up the scale and scope like Peter Jackson did with The Return of the King. It's kind of a roll of the dice. If you're going to change things up a lot for the third film, it can go two ways.
Well, and it depends on how you change it up for the third film, I think, too. is in Star Trek movie franchise, we had the motion picture, which was very kind of, here we are, regimental, like showing Starfleet and procedure and, kind of given the backstory and everything for all those who may not have been original series fans or who it had been years since the original series. So we got to set it up again. You go to Wrath of Khan, which is, I mean, there's a lot of slow parts, but there's a lot of action movie part in there. Some of the greatest space battle stuff in there. And then Search for Spock is where they start to try and turn Star Trek into a comedy. We go for a lot of the cheap jokes.
Right.
And
That is my overriding memory. It feeling very goofy compared to what I knew of Star Trek before that.
yeah, and I think it settled. It was a weird transition. I don't think the recasting of the Kirstie Alley, the Savick character, helped at all.
Right.
Because you're in the confusion on what happened to Kirstie. Where did she no? And but they just started to go for the cheap humor. I think by number 4, by the voyage home, they'd kind of hit their stride and going for the jokes, but I don't know. I know that there's out there are people who are a fan for Search for Spock. I think Spencer enjoys that one. But is I don't know. Maybe it's a middle ground. Is there a middle ground in the threequel? Is maybe it didn't completely jump off the rails, but it for certain didn't stick it and hit.
Yeah, it sounds like they got the healthier middle ground for the 4th one then. Afterwards, maybe the 3rd one with the lighthearted tone was a little too jarring, but by the time the 4th one came around, they had a better balance.
You're a little bit expecting it, as they got the tongue in cheek, they got the funny jokes. It's become very meme worthy and quotable. Yeah, because that's what's the real true mark of a film at this point is it meme worthy?
Yeah, will it spin the meta, hit the zeitgeist of fan forums, Reddit boards, and circled on social media.
That isn't always a good thing.
Not really, but it's something that fans can make of the content, whether it's
somehow
good or
Palpatine
not.
returned. Wait, no. Oh, that's it. Okay, I want to when we see Oscar Isaacs at a Comic-Con, I want to see how many times that quote is asked for and how many times it takes him to flat refuse.
I loved that line though, because it's such like a fourth wall breaking thing when you see the look on his face as he's saying it.
Yeah.
This is what it's come to.
Yeah, he crushed it with the delivery. You see it in his eyes. It's almost disbelief in universe and out.
Yes. Perfect. All right, let's go other ones. T3.
Oh, falling off.
That's the first of the Terminator movies where they decided, okay, we're just going to start repeating the same plot of the second one over and over again. And it's like, no.
Yeah.
And like, if you can't get Edward Furlong back, don't bother pursuing this character. It's like a junkie now. It's like, what? Okay, you made a cool looking new Terminator with new abilities and all that, which is the one thing that franchise manages to do pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's jokey, it's goofy, it's like, why are they changing the tone and everything and turning this into like a PG-13 type, comedy, action comedy? It's like, that's not what the Terminator franchise is.
Yeah.
So is that the downfall? Is that what happens? Because this is kind of getting in the ones we're talking about. That's what happens. Search for Spock. It starts going down a little comedy road. I mean, those who did not appreciate Jedi.
Yeah.
Same kind of thing.
Were they a little too goofy? A little too kind
of. Is that Superman
same thing happened.
We throw in a professional stand-up comedian to play this major role because we want to
same thing happened with Thor Ragnarok. It's like, yeah, let's stop trying now and just start making it as funny as possible at the
Right.
expense of the source material.
See, that
Well,
was
in Ragnarok's defense, after the Dark World, could
Wait,
they
that
have-
was a bad movie, but that's
Yeah.
not why it was a bad movie.
Right.
yeah. That was one that I was going to bring up later. Yeah, Thor Ragnarok is the kind of go-to massive kind of total 180 in terms of everything Thor had been up until that point. And I think depending on how much you hold the original source material as gospel almost, will determine how much you can enjoy that film on its own merits versus how much you're thinking, oh great, this has got the quippy Guardians of the Galaxy type feel, but times 10. And Taika Waititi always has that kind of inimitable, quirky style, and that kind of stuff I thought was fantastic, and it did reinvigorate the kind of Thor universe within the greater MCU scheme of things pretty well. But I definitely understand why it didn't fit well with some fans of the comics and of Thor, at least even in the films up until that point, because you are totally turning around the character from what we've seen previously, and that won't always land with the audiences. But then on the flip side, I think Thor Ragnarok is a really fantastic entry point to Marvel, because it works well as an almost individual film, because it is so distinct from Thor and Thor: The Dark World. And there's the fact that you have Chris Hemsworth playing a kind of rejuvenated but very jokey Thor. It almost means how he was character-wise beforehand isn't even relevant. So it is one that I think maybe with Kevin Feige's instruction, he allowed Taika Waititi to infuse it with his character and his kind of playfulness that changed up what they might have seen from a production standpoint as a series that was kind of waning with Thor: The Dark World. But exactly as you say, Catherine, it wasn't the tone that was the problem with The Dark World as much as writing, character, story, behind the scenes changes with Patty Jenkins leaving and all sorts of things.
I mean,
Yeah, but it's the kind of example of what it's like. Yeah, we're gonna try something different, but we're gonna give up at the same time by making it completely goofy, and that kind of like what they did with Search for Spock. It's like, let's change it into a comedy. It's like, okay.
and
Like,
I wonder where a lot of those decisions came from in Search for Spock, because isn't Search for Spock the first of those films that the cast was directing? Didn't Nimoy direct Search for Spock?
yeah, that was his terms for coming back.
Yeah.
Well,
So
that's an ultimatum.
and you know, that's gone on, and that's happened with episodes of The Next Generation and those movies, because you've got Frakes directing some of those. Nimoy directed several others, and I think, you know, I don't know. I don't know if you can throw that stuff in. But I mean, we're talking about Taika directing Ragnarok and just changing and making it his style. The MCU and defining what is the third of a trilogy or what is the threequel in the MCU is difficult for me, because, you know, Thor, it's the third Thor movie, but it's not the third MCU movie. And we've all been watching these interconnectedness and all this, because you mentioned Guardians, and you've seen, okay, it took the kind of tone of Guardians because Guardians came before it. So is it a sequel to Thor? Is it a sequel to Guardians? That's difficult for me to define which is which.
Right. Yeah, DMCU is definitely its own thing because it's such a massive interconnected universe that there's the character trilogies within it, with the original Avengers for the most part, like the Captain America trilogy. But then again, there you see Civil War is so much of an Avengers 0.5, kind of Avengers 2.5, chronologically speaking, because it's bringing in so many wider characters. It's not really a Captain America film as such. It's a kind of Steve versus Tony with the Avengers scattered left and right on who's right and who's wrong. But it's a really good point that the MCU trilogies are very different to the regular third or threequel in
I
these other
mean,
trilogies, because they're not wrapping things up so much.
I kind of see them in a, you have to go in the chronological order that they were released MCU entirely. It's kind of like it becomes a Friday the 13th franchise. It's like, Guardians of the Galaxy 2 is really Friday, MCU part 47.
Yeah. There are quite a few hoops to jump through if you haven't been watching them as they come out. But I guess then again, if we're looking at just the Avengers films in isolation, technically you could say Infinity War and Endgame are the trilogy capper on the Avengers trilogy going for starting out. And it has the extra difficulty of trying to finish a 22 film storyline essentially for the entire phase 3. And I think Infinity War, I'd say, has that Revenge of the Sith feel to it. Yeah, I mean, the end of Infinity War and what happens, I think, made a lot of people think, oh, they're going kind of the Empire route. Wow, that's pretty brave in having, I mean, total character desolation for the most part, which is interesting in a third film in the series. But then on the flip side, you could argue, well, it's a part one, an Endgame and Infinity War, kind of the third film in two parts.
Well, Infinity War being the third film also strikes a balance between spectacle and character. So you don't have an abundance of one in favor of the other. So it worked pretty well. Whereas Endgame very much feels like the fourth one in a series, because it's like cop out after cop out after cop out, plot armor after plot armor to be able to conveniently wrap everything up as quickly as possible.
It almost had to, though, in a way.
Yeah, it's. I guess that's probably the one time ever where fan fiction was better than the movie, which I couldn't believe, but it was true. So yeah, MCU is entirely different. Kind of like with Iron Man 3, they just let Shane Black do his own thing, and I guess he didn't get the memo that this character's supposed to come back in more sequels, right? And that just kind of, it's like that was a situation of trying to merge two completely unrelated stories and shove them into the same thing, which is the same, being the Extremis storyline and the Mandarin storyline, which is the same thing that happened in X-Men 3, where you're taking the Leech storyline of the Cure and mixing it with the Dark Phoenix saga. It's like, why are you doing that? Why? And the falling into the trappings of it having to be epic, so let's kill off a lot of major characters, even though virtually all of them were game to come back to do more movies and did come back to do more movies.
Yeah, eventually.
See, I think Catherine's hitting on and mentioning a lot of ones here, which we could probably do an entirely separate show later on, which is comic book storylines, established comic book storylines, and their transition to the movies and why they've been dumbed down, thrown together, and changed in huge ways. Because I mean, I read the Dark Phoenix saga in the comic. I think I've got the graphic novel on the shelf right there, and you're seeing parts of it in pieces, and you're like, whoa. And then the same thing, you've got the Wolverine movies, where now Jackman in the X-Men movies has been great and amazing, and I loved it. But then you try and tell the Wolverine story from the Frank Miller Wolverine graphic novel, and nope. Infinity War, and they simplified and changed in so much. I mean, up to changing the motivations of Thanos. If those of you out there who are MCU fans who have never actually read the Infinity Gauntlet, you'd be amazed.
Go for it, yeah.
But I think that might have hit on a whole other show.
Yeah, it's great that you bring up Wolverine, actually, because I would say, again, if you're looking at just as a character trilogy, you have X-Men Origins Wolverine, which the less said about that, the better. We can talk about. I mean, that deserves a whole 30 minutes of what went wrong list. Then you've got the Wolverine. James Mangold kind of brought a little bit more balance and nuance to Logan's character. But then the third film in Logan itself, I think, is a fantastic third film. And that really bucks the trend, because I think that's the only trilogy, if we can call it, where you have a total ascendancy from first film definitely in the negative, second film being kind of mid, third film being, for me, pretty strong. And again, you can almost take somebody who isn't, totally up to speed with definitely the X-Men film franchise and still have a fantastic journey through that film, with the Old Man Logan adapted storyline. And yeah, it's I think that might be the only one that comes to mind in terms of a trilogy that finishes at the third film is at the highest point of the three, because it's hard to do. But when you've got such a terrible first film, it's a little bit easier.
Yeah, X-Men Apocalypse is another one that falls into the traps of the third act of a trilogy. Just way too much spectacle, not enough character. I think no.
Yeah. Although by the time X-Men Apocalypse rolled around, I was already hurt by X-Men 3, The Last Stand. So I was almost expecting them just to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, and pump up their CGI budget, because I guess they didn't want to think about the story too much. And you could add to that same pile Sam Raimi's trilogy, because Spider-Man 2 is a strong sequel, and most people would probably say definitely expands on everything that the first Spider-Man 2002 film did well. And then Spider-Man 3 is just, again, like you said, with X-Men 3 putting in multiple comic storylines with Dark Phoenix and Leech and the X-Men Cure, and then hints of Sentinels, but not quite. Then you've got just a villain overload, and studio decisions to just say, all right, if you're directing this, you got to put this villain in because we can sell toys. Venom, let's just tack him on the end. He's almost a total third act character who has nothing to do with much going on in that film. And that is recipe for, I think, a total failure of a third film, when you've got kind of studio meddling behind the scenes. And then if it's a comic book based film, multiple storylines going around with nothing set and no kind of actual decision made on let's go for this, and just focus and use the characters that we have established 2 films ago to create something new and have an interesting conflict, rather than just supervillain whirlwind. As
that was another issue with that film, is that they couldn't find a justifiable reason to even put the Sandman character in there. Oh, so let's just retcon something from the original movie to justify this character being here. It's like, if you don't have a reason for this character to be here, then why is it there?
Yeah.
Done.
But
so continuing going and looking at other franchises. So Catherine, I know one of your passions are Bond films, of course, now, and we talked about the difficulty of picking like a trilogies or a third in MCU. Do you view Bond like that? Is like the third Connery the trilogy, or is the third film there? Is there the third Daniel Craig film?
Well, I guess since they're not really that related to each other, it doesn't fall into the typical trappings of what you would say a trilogy is. In Connery's case, the third one was quite good, Goldfinger. But if you're going off of the actual storyline, then Thunderball would be the third one, because that's continuing the Spectre storyline, and that was still pretty good. If Daniel Craig one, which would be easier to judge, that would be
Skyfall, wouldn't it?
Skyfall, which is third. It's like, yeah, it looks gorgeous, but it's lacking a lot on story, but it's still pretty good. But the other ones, it's like, funny, most people will say that Roger Moore's third movie, Spy Who Loved Me, is his best. And then Brosnan's third one was The World Is Not Enough, which I think that was his best performance, even though the storyline was a little hokey. And then the other actors didn't have their third movies.
Right.
So that's kind of, mishmash all over the place for the third. And then there's things like the Indiana Jones saga. Third one, most people don't really like. I know Spencer says the third one's his favorite, and that slightly falls into the trappings of the third act of a trilogy because it's basically recycling the same plot of the first movie almost verbatim. It's like, we'll substitute Donovan for Belloc, we'll substitute Michael Byrne for Wolf Dietrich, we'll substitute the Grail for the Ark, but we're doing this, and instead of the working for government agents, we'll make the decision of him trying to save his father, which is really what the story's about, which makes that work fairly well.
Right.
Yeah, that was the strongest element.
It succeeds in overcoming the other rehash stuff to be a very good movie.
It does, but it almost follows that trap, and I think the reason it doesn't fall completely into that trap is because of the comedic elements that had been built into Raiders and Temple of Doom. There were already comedic elements and things there, but for sure, Grail falls. It keeps going down that road and keeps pushing that comedy line overtly, right? Is it almost falls into what we talked about of the trilogy trap, but Harrison and Sean Connery's performances, I think who did we want to see as Indiana Jones's father? Could it be anyone other than James Bond?
Yeah.
Another third one I liked better than the second one was Back to the Future 3. I like that because that's, the first two movies are kind of Marty's story and the third one is Doc's story, and I like that. And it's not as plot heavy as the second one was. And it's like a simple romance, Old West type story, and I like that.
Right.
And it's its own thing. It's trying to do something different compared to the first two. So
yeah, that is a total tonal change up for the third film, which is kind of what we've seen with with the Thor films, is the one that keeps coming back as a total tone change. And I think when looking at Back to the Future 3, it is a welcome break to just have everything slow down, because the second one was so rammed with so many things going on, not just in terms of story and development of character, but just the fact that you've got the futuristic setting finally. It's almost like sensory overload when you're parsing through just visually what they're trying to do. So the third film not only change of tone, but change of pace.
And they've given you kind of a genre change. It's like we've made it a Western.
Yeah,
like
completely.
Okay, it's like we made it. Yeah, it's a literal Western. There were kind of like Westerny elements maybe in 1955. It's the good guy, the bad guy. You've got the but you go ahead and let's make it a literal Western.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was gonna say another third movie I think falters a bit would be The Bourne Ultimatum, because it's a third of the Jason Bourne films, and once again they're trying to push the whole storyline of who Jason is, and it's like, the books, aside from telling you about Jason as a character, had individual plots themselves, which the films do not, because they're mostly about him trying to find out about his past, and by the time you get to the third movie, it just feels it's like you've beaten that dead horse a bit much now, and I thought it was a bit much, but it was still okay, but I thought it kind of fell into those trappings as well, partly because the thing I think works against that franchise in general is that you just kind of intrinsically know from the very beginning that he volunteered for this program, so it's not really a surprise when you get to the third movie and find that out. It's like which is like when you try and have a third act built around, or any movie really built around, a shocking revelation. It's like, well, it's got to be really good or have something to support it, like Empire Strikes Back. When the movie first came out, the I Am Your Father thing wasn't like, oh my God, that's so cool. It was like, wait, what? Yeah. But because you have the whole drama of the climax with Han Solo and Leia and all that, it just, in the way, and what happens to Luke, it just ties it all together really well. So there's a lot more going for it besides just it's not just going to hinge on a shock revelation like so many other imitators have done, where they have like a shock moment like that, and then it'll be like, to be continued, because they're trying to riff on Empire because there's nothing else there to support it.
Well, and Empire, I think a lot of the, get out of the theater that you've waited in a long line to see, and after you see that and you're like, what, did I miss something? What happened? How did that be? was the get back in line again to see it, because you're
Right.
like, no, but it was confusion and just amazement that you got to try and figure that out.
Yeah, having the magnitude of that kind of mic drop is bewildering for audiences and brave on the creators. So it's a win all round. And I think some this is not a threequel, but The Last Jedi had some subversion that worked well and some that didn't. And one of the Rise of Skywalker's many problems was that it had to follow The Last Jedi with a total creative difference behind the scenes, which makes the third film always difficult to fit in line with what's come before. The feeling of, just going back to the third of the indie films, I thought that because you have that, they struck a good balance between having the comedic humor and that kind of love-hate initial relationship between the Henry Joneses, kept that film moving forward, even if there were kind of tropes from the first film that were reused. And I'd say The Last Crusade might fall into the traps of using recycled tropes and ideas, but succeeds in terms of enjoyment and engagement with you and the characters, because that interplay between Sean Connery and Harrison Ford is magic. And I think many films wish they could have that kind of strong relationship flourish in a third film, which is very rare.
Well, and I think I think that one might have had some help. Okay, if I'm remembering correctly, between Temple of Doom and Grail, there was a big stretch, right? It's a big period before that film.
There was about 4 years between Temple of Doom being released and then starting to film Last Crusade, because they weren't sure, because George saying, "Oh, I have 3 stories in mind," and it's like, no, he didn't. And then they played around with the idea of the haunted castle. Then they decided no after Spielberg did Poltergeist and other stuff like that. And then they flirted with the idea of the whole Monkey King storyline, which got really goofy, and they got that into like script development stage, and then they wisely threw it like no. But then eventually they came around to doing it, so there was a bit more time. They put more thought and effort into it than others might, because they weren't interested in, they didn't have any set release date, so they could spend as much time as they wanted.
Well, and I think for me as a viewer, there had been more character development, because in that intervening years, isn't that when Young Indiana Jones Chronicles was out?
No, that came afterwards in the 90s.
Oh, that was after
that was
one?
early 90s, I think.
Yeah, it was early 90s. Yeah, that was
that is what messes with you in your brain, because see, I was thinking that entire opening sequence of the Cross of Coronado and stuff like that with younger Indy was, what they were bringing that into the movie from the show. But I guess I don't know if I saw it in reverse order, or it's just that way in my brain.
Yeah, that show got started largely because he wanted to, George wanted to practice more with ILM and pushing the boundaries of what you could do with that tech, and among other things. And it was at the time one of the most expensive shows ever produced, because it was like $1 million an episode, because they were always shooting on location and going all over the place. And that it wasn't a bad show, actually. It was actually pretty decent. There's a bunch of them on YouTube for anybody who wants to watch them. And the DVDs are still out there that you can get on Amazon, but
they're right over there.
Right.
Yeah. But those were good. Yeah, those were good. Having Indy acquire all of his traits in the prologue sequence is a bit okay. That was kind of funny, but and I kind of I half expected in the third movie. That's one of the few things I remember about seeing that for the first time. I expected the guy who gave him a hat to come back later on, but no, they brought back the other guy instead.
Oh yeah.
There was so much mystery to how he got that hat, and he just kind of nonchalantly walks off after giving what looked like a piece of his identity to
yeah. I thought that was a great scene, though. He's like not upset about it. It's like, yeah, here you go, kid.
How it works.
What was the Monkey King idea they initially floated?
it's based on some type of mythology. I can't remember all of it off the top of my head, but
Sure.
it was very bizarre, and it was like going into like sub-Saharan Africa, and you meet this actual monkey king, which is like a living, breathing, talking thing, which they probably would have done with animatronic. It was getting really into hokey territory where it's like, with Empire, the question was, we need to get Yoda working because the whole movie can collapse if this is Kermit the Frog, as they said, running around in this movie. Similarly, it's like the Monkey King. It's like you have these very, swashbuckling adventure types, or Indy's beating up Nazis in the first one, and he's beating up thuggy people in the second. The third one, you want the thing to be the main focus to be like the Monkey King, and it's just, and they're trying to even shoehorn things with the haunted cat. It just wasn't working,
Yeah.
and so that's when they kind of, rather than doing more research on other cultures, they just decided to fall back on what they thought was the safe route for, we'll go back to the well of the Nazis again. It feels what they're doing again with the fifth movie, which is, that's another story.
Well, they do have we don't want them to build on the Crystal Skull, so.
Well, you don't have to build on that. There's so many other things that they could use for story directions, but yeah, we'll see.
Don't let them get to popularity. Somehow the Thuggee returned. No.
Yeah, well, just going by what you told us, I'm so glad they stayed away from the Monkey King plot, because just imagining a giant kind of late 80s animatronic puppet that is like the ruler of a hidden kingdom, and then where's the character and the conflict there?
Yeah, they did recycle some of the idea of the hidden kingdom stuff with Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, with the Mayan Aztec type temple, except they transposed that to like South America rather than Africa, but it was like similar ideas where you find this lost hidden culture that was surrounded in the Monkey King thing would have been surrounded about worshiping the Monkey King, whereas in Crystal Skull it's worshiping the Crystal Skull alien thing.
Right.
So let's talk about outside of just trilogies. Okay, Nolan ends on that's where that ends. A third movie, a threequel that then continues the franchise is, Star Wars is difficult because we as Star Wars fans, I think, see them as a trilogy of trilogies and don't see them necessarily all the time as 1 through 9. But we were talking about Star Trek. Search for Spock is number 3. It's not the end. It's not the end of a trilogy. It's actually kind of a 2-parter. It's a cliffhanger that goes on to 4, which then goes on to 5, which which then goes on to 6, which is better,
stronger, from the reserves,
stronger and in there. So Terminator does the same thing. Superman does the same thing. Is they're continuing beyond there. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Do they continue?
Sometimes they're continuing simply because they can, not because it's set up to continue. Like Terminator 3 is essentially, we're going to retcon the thing saying that, it's not that Judgment Day is prevented, it's just delayed. So here's the beginnings of Judgment Day, which admittedly look kind of neat, but then it's like, okay, you're at the end of the story and you don't like either of your two characters. And it's like, we don't really want to see any more from this. So we don't end up seeing any more from that. But then they recast the roles for Terminator 4, which, while it had the opportunity to be a different story, it tries to do the same old story of, we have to protect somebody again. And it's like, they keep going back to that well. It's like, no. So that's an issue. Or like Batman Forever is not really, it's its own self-contained thing. Definitely a tonal shift from the first two. Very goofy and silly, and then they just not really set up for a sequel per se. It's like, they tease at the end that, okay, Batman and Robin have worked out their bullshit, so now that they're gonna be together as a great team, and then they decide to see how far they can jump the shark in the fourth one.
Well, they got the long jump record there.
In fact, they did. And I'm actually going to put in the comments, because I had that brought up. We talked about jumping the shark, and I know that not everybody exactly knows what that is. I'm going to put a link to a YouTube video of Fonzie literally jumping the shark.
Yeah,
I'll put that up in the comments.
that'll be fun to
And
see.
that's where that term comes from. It's just when, you know, well, maybe I'll put it up there in the comments because
It's when you're using cheap gimmicks to get people to keep watching your show because you have nothing left in strength of character or plot.
yes.
Yeah.
So that was, and of course, that's all not literal jumping the shark, unlike the jackass screw who did that and got bit by the shark. and
That would be another video to see.
Yeah, that'd be another video. That was a good video to see. And then of course, the new version of that phrase, "nuke the fridge" from the fourth Indiana Jones.
Oh, yeah.
That's another one. So
I'm gonna have to put this in the comments afterwards. It's not letting me like put it in there. It's on the YouTube link.
Oh, no
But
worries. Well, yeah.
Jeff is saying that's the
Different.
best Happy Days episode ever.
no,
And I was like, yeah, it was trying to reinvigorate it. It did something. Go watch it. It's Fonzie in the leather jacket with shorts and like a little yellow life preserver on, and it is built up so dramatically. There's several clips on YouTube, so don't just search for it. Use the link that I gave. It's like a 2-minute and 30-second clip. It shows the buildup and the it shows like Potsy and Ralph Mouth and how that it's there. But so I mean, Superman 3 for me jumps the shark with Richard Pryor and then only gets sillier when it goes to the quest for peace.
Yeah.
It's like they forgot that there were but these series is based on comic books, which has all sorts of rich source material that you could draw from for the third and fourth one.
Yeah.
Well, but that's a whole thing that they keep forgetting in general, is because the statement has been made out there in real life. They said in their out loud voice, you know, we don't know how to make Superman relevant in the modern world for the modern viewer. Hello, comic books.
What?
You need to read them.
Or at least have some comic book consultants who could say, hey, this incredible storyline, give this a go, or adapt it in some way.
Yeah. Like I said, I think that's a whole other show that we're going to have to do at some point, because, you know, we can talk about the failings or the successes of you know, attempting to throw the Dark Knight Returns into the Justice League and Batman versus Superman and that sort of thing, and
Sure,
successes, failures, but
yeah, ebbs and flows. And
yeah, other jump the sharks. Have we talked about? I don't know. We haven't talked about a third that continues in Potter franchise. They don't.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up as a relatively strong threequel. You know, not quite matching the kind of dizzying heights at times from Return of the King, but as another very popular IP that's in the fantasy world. You've got the genre shift from what you had with the Chris Columbus Philosopher's Stone, Sorcerer's Stone, and Chamber of Secrets into Prisoner of Azkaban, and I think that works very well for that film because they were fairly strong in staying true to the novels, and when you've got an established universe that is so strong already in a young adult series that works well as individual stories, as well as following the kind of the hero's journey of Harry through the 7 books, 7 years. I thought Prisoner of Azkaban worked really well.
I mean, that may be a commonality, is that you've had the novels and the books, and don't start putting the nasty comments, Potter heads, that, you know, oh no, what do you mean they didn't change the books? Yes, they changed the books, but here's the thing. I think a lot of the changes in the characters and how the characters were originally described in the novels, when they adapted them to the movie, they stayed fairly consistent in their changes throughout. You know,
yes, relatively speaking,
it is. So they chose what they were going to change. They made those big changes, and they drew that out and continued it through the films, so you don't feel so much of the craziness from, oh, it's one to this to that. The same thing with Lord of the Rings trilogies is, I think that got to be a little crazy once they had done Lord of the Rings and then went back to The Hobbit.
Yeah. Totally. Right there with that's where you kind of.
Yeah, that was also an example of something that was meant to be 2 movies, and then once Jackson took the reins, it became 3.
Yeah, but then didn't New Line also say to him they wanted that, and then he brought in the wider, the kind of the wider material with the bringing in like Radagast Brown and having the kind of mystery, but definitely not mystery of Sauron's return as the necromancer and all that.
Yeah, which so much does not belong in that story.
Yeah. It would have been a pretty good, Lord of the Rings prequel, just taking all that out and making it a separate story. There was enough there, but jammed into The Hobbit and then stretching The Hobbit, which is a pretty concisely written novel, into 3 massive films just to kind of reach the same scope as the Lord of the Rings.
It had already been done in an amazing cartoon.
Oh yeah.
And then they decided to undercut it even more by using a bunch of CGI instead of prosthetics for their orcs and trolls and everything, which I don't understand that decision because it looks so bad compared to the way how great it looked in the Rings trilogy.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing, I don't know if this is justifiable, but there was a behind the scenes of it wasn't so much budgetary as it was they just went with CG because the studio gave them that option, and they thought for some reason it would be easier, even though CG can be really labor intensive when you've got so many different smaller studios working within just the visual effects section of a massive film. And this was 3 films, so everything had that kind of plastic shine instead of the really good model making for the structures and then prosthetics for the the orcs and goblins.
Yeah.
Well, it is just about that time, people. So final thoughts. Curse of the Threequel. What is it?
It's lack of planning, spectacle over story, inherent need to try and retcon things to tie it into the first movie just because. And yeah, those are kind of, I think, my 3 pointers as to what usually becomes a problem with Threequels.
Yeah, and I will add to that is it forcing some sort of genre change, whether you're injecting comedy for comedy, just that hasn't been a part of it, just boom, blowing that in there and forcing that genre change, and the potential of needing to sell more action figures, so introducing characters for that sake.
Yeah, that's definitely what comes about with some of these comic book adaptations where the third film kind of falls off. It's just merch. We have the chance to put these faces on lunchboxes, action figures, and socks, everything. So let's shift some units and hit big bank for the studio.
Yeah.
And I think the Threequel films that work well are the ones that stay true to the kind of overall feel, even though that's a really vague thing to say. But it's kind of theme, character, and tone that has worked well in the first film and hopefully progressed well in the second film. If they can tie up those ends, then a third film is strong. And if it's going down the trope pitfalls, as we mentioned, then it's gonna jump the shark.
Yeah, and largely the ones there that have been planned out and have some sort of basis, whether it's being true to a comic book storyline or a novel series, or well, I guess this is still staying true to novels, as like Catherine was mentioning in the Bond film, but the Bond films aren't necessarily a continuous storyline. It's individually, but they stand on their own, each one basically, but they've been planned out. So it can be fought past, there can be, but I think we found way more examples where it just doesn't work than it does. And there are dozens upon dozens more that I think I can think of that we didn't mention. Hello, Jaws 3.
Yeah. Speaking of jumping the shark, it's right there.
Jaws 3D.
Uh,
And we won't even start on that, but amazing actors in that, great actors in that, but fail. But anyway, please continue to join us on the Virtual Cantina Network for Andor August and then some. We will be getting, go ahead.
And we don't plan on doing an examination of the fourth entries in series because we're just not going to go there.
No, we do not need to examine in detail the fourth entries. We will spare you that.
I tell you, the third entry in horror movies are interesting because even they try and follow the rules of that. Like Scream 3 is literally a textbook commentary on the third acts of trilogies and their pitfalls.
Why did we not think of that earlier? We could have, yes, it's let's break the fourth wall and literally tell all the viewers what the rules to making this are.
Yeah.
Oh.
Smash it down.
But yes, so Andor August and then some. Monday night we will have the next episode of Rebels Revisited. We are going to get to more content, more Andor content on this show later in the and then some, since the release of Andor was pushed back. We're pushing back our special episodes. But the Virtual Cantina happy hour right there, Tuesday night, drop in and we can talk about all things Andor, all things, Threequel, all things that you want to discuss. And then Thursday on the Virtual Cantina watch along, we'll be watching some more episodes of the Clone Wars that lead up to and we think are going to affect things that we will see in Andor. So until we see you again here on the VCN, may the Force be with you.
Thanks. May the Force be with you all.
Force be with you.